Hello and welcome to the crux of medtech. We go beyond the buzzwords, bringing you the insights from the innovators, investors, and leaders who are driving this life-saving space forward. Because I'm absolutely fascinated by the stories that people have to tell in medtech. As someone who works in this sector on a daily basis, I come across so many interesting people and so many interesting stories that I think the world deserves to know about. Welcome to the crux of medtech.
So Liam, first of all, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, look, it's really good to have you on the sofa. So to start off with, I want to open with a big question. Every year in the US alone, 43,000 patients develop a serious complication after surgery that costs $1 billion to treat. And surgeons often don't know why it's happened until the patient is already in the ICU. When you first heard about that problem, what did you think?
Well, first of all, this problem is personal to me. So GI surgery and the risk of leaks is something that surgeons lay awake about, they worry about. Everything they do in the OR is focused on making sure that their anastomosis has integrity. So a couple things. One, it's personal because my son has Crohn's disease. And so with a GI disease like that, there is a risk that he's going to have surgery at some point in time in his life. And so when I think about the outcomes of a leak, including death and permanent loss of bowel function, I think about Colin. And so when I'm tired and it's a late night or an early morning, that kind of keeps me motivated to make a difference and hopefully eliminate something or reduce the impact of surgical leaks for him. The unfortunate part is that new data shows that the leak rates that were historically in the 5 to 6 range, more recent data shows that that rate is actually much higher. In colorectal surgery, it's 18 to 20%. And that's new data that was reported from some of the world leaders in surgery. And so it's even a bigger problem than what the surgical community thinks of and has historically looked at leak rates. And even so, 5 to 6%, that's not an acceptable rate. I don't think anyone wants a 5 to 6% or a 20% leak rate. You know, the target is always getting as close to zero as possible. And so that's the big problem that Qaelon's trying to solve.
So traditionally, why is there such a big leak rate? Why does it exist in surgery right now?
Well, first of all, surgeons are doing everything they can with the technology they have. What they have is the air bubble test. The same way you check a bicycle tire for a leak, you submerge it in water and look for bubbles. That's what surgeons have at their disposal today. And, you know, this test dates back to 1910. That's before the discovery of penicillin. That's how old the air bubble test is. It's a visual analog inspection of the anastomosis. And the unfortunate part is really small holes you can't really see with the naked eye. And so you need to use technology in a powerful way to very accurately detect leaks. And so Qaelon's digitizing leak detection. Everything in surgery is becoming digitized. This is one of the major problems and complications that hasn't been digitized yet. And so that's what we're doing.
That's awesome. And we're going to dive into how you guys have approached it in a little while. But first of all, I want to go back to Colin and your family's experience with Crohn's. Talk us through it. Like, when did you find out that your son had Crohn's?
Yeah, so first of all, his mom has Crohn's, and we discovered when he was a young teen that he had Crohn's as well. And so we're very thankful that infusion therapy and medical therapy is managing it well. He's also amazing at taking care of his health and making sure that he stays healthy. But that has a big, impact on a young person where they have to constantly manage their body, where their friends don't have to worry about what they eat and what they do and rest and everything that goes with that. And so that's been a big challenge for him. He's approached it with strength and with compassion. I think it's made him a really cool person to face that. And then, right now he's a volleyball coach. He coaches a number of beach and indoor volleyball teams. But what he really is focused on is helping kids grow. He's also studying to be a mental health counselor. And so those two experiences, I think, have, kind of shaped him, where he has incredible empathy for patients and for young kids going through adversity. Certainly, that's what motivates me. Early in my career, or early in my university career, I had aspirations to become a doctor until I took organic chemistry, which didn't work out so well.
Okay.
I got a D, and I think I probably should have flunked, but there was some compassion of the professor there. I realized at that time, like, the scientific requirements of being a doctor or a surgeon weren't there. And so I had to give up on that, became a United States naval officer, had a great 5 years there in the leadership experience. But I've always wanted to be in healthcare. And so that journey restarted when I got out of the Navy and started with Johnson & Johnson. And from there, just loved being able to impact healthcare and contribute in a way that you can contribute even without being a surgeon or a doctor.
Awesome. So Colin's going to need surgery in the future. I think that's kind of what you were leading to. So with Crohn's, what's the surgery he's going to need in the future?
Yeah, so with Crohn's, while the medical treatments are very, very advanced, usually one of the treatments is a resection. So you remove the highly inflamed tissue, not different than colorectal cancer, where if you have a significant nodule where they need to go remove that section of the colon, and then you join it back together. And so that's the anastomosis, where you remove the disease portion, you reconnect the intestine, and then you wait for it to heal. The leaks occur despite using staplers, using perfusion to check the blood supply, doing every possible delicate treatment of tissue, making sure there's no tension on the anastomosis. The surgeons out there are fastidious about handling that tissue as carefully as possible, looking at the way the staples form, the way the anastomosis form. That's the inspection, the visual inspection. And despite all that, the leak rates are still very, very high. Part of it's that surgical leaks are a multifactorial, complicated problem. It's not just one factor that leads to a surgical leak. And I think that's the promise of data. And it's driving our data strategy. We know that we see the tissue at the time of surgery, and we give real-time information to the surgeon. What's really powerful is when you can combine preoperative data, intraoperative data, not just from our device, but from other devices used during the procedure, staplers, perfusion, imaging, insufflation, and then the postoperative data as well. And so what we're creating is a GI data ecosystem to take that information all the way across the surgical journey, which means that now surgeons have predictive information. They can intervene in real time, which means before the patient gets sick, they can look at a leak, look at a defect, and decide how to treat that, so that when the patient leaves the operating theater, that bowel has integrity. Closure has been confirmed. That's what we're working on.
So what are the factors that actually go into a leak? So it's multifactorial problem. So what's actually happening that causes leaks?
Yeah, so there's a couple classifications, and I'm not a surgeon, but I've been in this space for a very long time. So first of all, you have the technical leaks. That means that the stapler did not do what it should have done, or the staples didn't form because there was abnormal tissue. So those are technical leaks. Those should be discovered in the operating room so that a surgeon can do something about them. The next category, I would say, is perfusion. So the blood supply that's at the healing site, you want very strong blood supply to that area. And so part of the operation is to remove the blood supply from the tissue that you're going to resect and remove. But sometimes that creates a borderline situation where the subtleties of, do I have good perfusion? Do I have great perfusion? Which is one of the reasons why the ICG technologies are standard today. Recent clinicals have come out just in the last couple of weeks from Leeds that shows that perfusion makes a huge difference. And when you have perfusion information at the time of surgery in real time, you can confirm that there's going to be blood supply after the procedure. And then the third category is around biome. And this is a newer category. People are studying it. It certainly affects the way the tissue heals. And so those are kind of the three major categories. What Qaelon is doing is, first of all, we're focused on the technical leaks. We'll give the surgeon information at the time of surgery so that if they see a defect or something they're concerned about, they can act before the patient leaves and is very sick. The second part on perfusion, that captures leaks that happen even a little bit later than the technical leaks. So if the technical leaks present themselves in the first 0 to 7 days, those are the worst leaks. Those are the ones that the patient gets sick very often. 80% of those patients have a second surgery before they've even recovered from the first one. And 18% of the colorectal surgery patients that have an early leak die. And so that's where we're there to focus and give information around the technical leaks. What we also have developed is using our insufflation technology with perfusion systems. And so we actually have IP around this where the combination of both of those, our system makes the perfusion technologies more accurate. And so you'll see subtleties that you can't see when you use the two technologies in combination. Part of what perfusion does is you're looking at blood supply, but it's under relaxed conditions. So the minute that patient leaves the OR and the bowel starts to work again, peristalsis, the movement of contents of the bowel through the intestine, once that starts, you now have resistance to perfusion that you weren't able to test for with perfusion technologies alone. And so we actually simulate with our device peristalsis. So now you have resistance to perfusion, which means the subtleties, the real small subtleties that a surgeon can't see without the combination of both therapies, that's where we can add to it. And so that extends the view and the impact of our technology into the perfusion time frame, which is about 4 to 10 days. And so when you think about the worst leaks, if you have the Qaelon leak technology for technical leaks, you have combination use with perfusion, now you're covering the first 10 days or more of postoperative healing. That's where the worst part happens. That's where the worst outcomes happen. The ones that declare themselves after 10 or 14 days are usually not as significant clinically. They can be treated with very conservative methods. So that's where our technology plays into the care pathway.
So how does the technology actually work? What's the approach?
So what we're doing is we are precisely monitoring gas concentrations in the surgical cavity. So when you do minimally invasive surgery, whether that's laparoscopic, robotic, and of course endoluminal surgery, you are creating space to operate. That's what the insufflation does. It pumps CO2 into the surgical cavity to create stability. And so the chest wall rises up, you have space for your instruments. That steady pressure is very important because as that varies, you actually drive CO2 into other parts of the body. And when CO2 gets absorbed by other parts of the body, it causes pain. You know, one of the number one outcomes of any minimally invasive surgery is referred shoulder pain. That's the CO2 gas traveling into the joints because it's been absorbed by the patient. And so the surgical cavity should be 100% CO2. You're creating that space. We measure gas concentration. So when you're testing an organ, you inflate room air into that organ. And if the air gets from the organ into the surgical cavity, you no longer have 100% CO2. And so we're monitoring that precisely with very precise sensors. And within milliseconds, we can start to detect changes in that gas concentration. Once the gas concentration goes below 100% for CO2 and above about 2% for oxygen, we have double confirmation that there's a problem. And then it's a matter of starting to intervene and finding the leak and making a repair.
Understood. So let's talk about that intervention then. So what's the surgeon's options if they detect there's a surgical leak?
So there's a lot of clinical studies that talk about what's the best method. When you know you have a leak, you've done an anastomosis, what do you do? I think the data that shows, the clinicals that I've seen show that redoing the anastomosis is often the best clinical outcome, that's not usually the pathway that's used. Usually it's a small leak. And so the first instinct is just to close that one leak if you have a defect somewhere. So you would use a suture to suture it closed. You could use a sealant, like a fibrin sealant or a synthetic sealant, to close that hole. That's essentially, what they'll do. Now, in some cases, the hole is so small that the surgeon says, I'm not going to intervene. And one of the big questions we get around the leak size is, what leaks are clinically significant? And this is where I might disagree a little bit with our surgeon audience. I don't think we really know what size of a leak is clinically significant, because we've never been able to measure the size of a leak. We've never been able to study how a 1 millimeter leak is different than a 5 millimeter leak. And we know the larger the size, the clinical complications present themselves much more rapidly, much more severely. But on the small ones, a 1 millimeter hole, and I've heard this from many surgeons who've said, Liam, a 1 millimeter hole can kill a patient, and a 1 millimeter hole can be completely innocuous. And so one of the reasons why data strategy is so embedded in our corporate strategy is we believe that we can provide answers or transparency where surgeons can assess exactly what is clinically significant. And it's going to be different. An anterior defect versus a posterior defect may present differently. Is it closer, to the rectum, or is it, closer to the small bowel? All these different factors that up until now we can't study, now with Qaelon's data point. And so we've created the first objective performance indicator, the OPIs. That's what drives machine learning and AI. So we now have a quantifiable data point that when you link that to the entire surgical journey, we can start to answer some of these questions about what is clinically significant. And I think that that's the exciting part of the future part. We're going to help treat leaks in the operating room. We're going to empower surgeons with data that complements their judgment. But that data is the future value of where we can truly change the paradigm of how GI patients are treated in the operating room.
Okay. So right now, the standard of care is you have to do a bubble test, and that's a physical thing that you have to do as a surgeon, operate on that patient. What you're planning to do is real time have those updates so that immediately as a leak happens, you can understand that's happened and then the surgeon reacts to it.
There's two things. One is an acute test. So you finish your procedure and you do a leak test. And that information, the surgeon can assess their anastomosis right in that moment. The other part of our capability is constant monitoring. So we're running our leak detection test in the background during the entire procedure. And so part of the beauty of software is that you can create an alert system that as soon as a leak is detected, for example, an off-camera injury where an instrument gets inserted and you puncture the bowel and now air is coming in. You're not really looking at a defect at that time, but we could actually monitor that throughout the procedure. But our main focus is that acute leak detection test once the procedure is complete.
I want to take a minute to say thank you to our sponsors, TTP. TTP is a leader in complex medical device development. With deep scientific and engineering expertise, they help medtech teams crack tough development challenges and make the right calls early, reducing rework, delays, and uncertainty later on. Whether you're navigating uncharted technical territory or racing towards market, TTP brings clarity and real-world judgment to the decisions that shape performance, usability, and manufacturability. By retiring risk early and grounding innovation in real-world constraints, they help you move forward with speed and confidence. To find out more, check out the show notes. So where's the business at right now in today's terms? Where are you at as a company, and what you're expecting to come next?
So I think we're starting the fun part. That's going to be the exciting part, where we take a very high performing prototype with a large data set. We've tested this system in every possible way, every different location of a leak, every different surgical situation that could happen. So we feel very confident that with over 1,200 preclinical tests, that we have a high performing prototype. So far, we've had 100% accuracy of our system, detecting 1 millimeter holes, which many of which you can't see with the naked eye. And so now we get to go and take that prototype and put it through the development. So when people ask me, I always say, the R part of R&D is really done. We're not trying to improve the system. We have a very high performing system. Now we need to do the documentation, create the consistency, the quality to get it through the regulatory agencies, whether that's the notified bodies here in Europe or the FDA. And that's our next step.
Excellent. And this technology integrates across surgery, robotic surgery, you said an luminal surgery as well. So looking at all of the current surgery world, talk us through some of those scenarios where this can be integrated technology alongside those.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting in the marketplace is you had video tower systems for years that were independent from robotic systems. And so they weren't overlapping, they weren't competing with each other. Now, as robotics continues to advance, you have the video tower companies that either have a robot or are contemplating adding a robot to their portfolio. And then you have robotic companies, the market leader Intuitive, who's actually putting their systems into ORs that don't have a robot. And so today, robotic ecosystems, robotic towers are competing with video towers. And so that is where the market is really blending together as it goes more and more towards robotics. We have a place in both of those systems. First of all, constant flow insufflation has been shown to be critical in robotic surgery, where any pressure changes can affect the workflow. They can affect the precision of what the robot can do. And so that's become a must-have, not a nice-to-have. And so constant flow insufflation, most of the video tower systems that are out there today have pulsed insufflation systems, which means they pump CO2 and then they stop, they measure the pressure, then they wait, and then they start pumping again. And so that on-off pulsed system isn't aligned with what robotic surgery needs, where constant, stable pressure is critical. The other part of constant flow insufflation, which has been proved very well by AirSeal at ConMed, and I spent 1.5 years at ConMed. I launched the AirSeal robotic solution. It was really fun to launch that with the being compatible with the Da Vinci robot. So they've seen that the outcomes that happen in robotics are improved by constant flow insufflation. For the patient, though, constant flow insufflation enables lower pressure surgery. So when surgery started back in the 90s, laparoscopic surgery, they set the pressure at 15 millimeters of mercury. No idea why. And for 20 or 30 years, that was the standard. With lower pressure surgery, and AirSeal proved this very well, you have lower pain, lower opioid usage, and faster discharge. And so that's where constant flow is a must-have for robotic surgery. If I'm a patient, I want a constant flow insufflator used on me. Patients don't know what that is, but I'd rather have little or no opioid usage. The pain is what keeps you in the hospital and doesn't allow you to get discharged. And so as you think about the shift of surgery away from the operating room towards ambulatory surgery centers, this means that those patients are there longer. And so if you can operate with low pressure surgery, that makes a big difference in outcomes, in process, and in costs.
Well, I'm going to dive into your career journey now, because you mentioned ConMed, being at AirSeal, but I do want to take it back to the early stages, which was coming into the world of J&J after the Navy. What drove that decision to go from Navy into the world of medical devices?
I would tell you that the main reason was I was very proud of my service as a naval officer. Had an opportunity at a very young age to lead a very large group of people, to be a watch officer on a ship. Luckily, I was not in combat, but that was a leadership experience that's very formative, and I was very proud to put on the uniform and to lead the men that were on my ship and that I was charged with. So when I came out after the Navy, I wanted to find a place that would make me as proud. And so at that time, I was interviewing with Ethicon, Johnson & Johnson, and I think in that era, and still to this day, J&J MedTech is one of the most respected organizations in the world. I was very proud to say, okay, I'm working with Ethicon. I work with surgeons. We were focused on open heart surgery, and that was one of our big specialties. So to be able to step into the operating theater with an open heart surgeon, guide them on suture selection, some suturing techniques, that was really kind of a proud transition, and I felt really good about that. And then what I saw was this steady stream of new technologies. And so as a sales rep and a sales manager and a marketing person, I got to launch these really cool technologies that changed the way surgery is done, that impacted the surgeon's outcomes. That was really exciting. That's what kind of got me started on the startup journey of how do you take really cool technology, innovative technology, and bring that into the OR.
So what were some of those products in Ethicon that you were responsible for launching?
So the fibrin glue, Ethicon joined or entered the biosurgery market where they had an internal startup. It was called Ethicon Biosurgery. And so Baxter had created this category 30 years before. And Ethicon said, we're going to build this category. This is a very impactful category. We're going to find a way to be number one or number two. That's the J&J strategy as a company, is we're going to enter a category. We're going to be number one or number two. We'll bring our marketing muscle. We'll bring our development. We'll bring our resources. And so I was one of the leaders that helped start that business. So we got to launch fibrin glues, synthetic sealants. Those products really made a difference. 5 years later, Ethicon had achieved market share leadership. So I kind of see that as a great success. And the impact that we had, we built the business. It was under the umbrella of J&J, which was a little safer. Now in startups, it's a lot less safe. You're on your own. You don't have the resources of a large company like J&J. And so that was kind of my beginning of the startup journey. It got me hooked on innovative technology. It's a singular focus on innovation and leadership and driving change in surgery rather than, handling an old product where you're administering, you're managing. I wanted to be on the cutting edge of leadership, and that's what pulled me into startups.
Awesome. And after 15 years at J&J, decided to step out. What was driving that change and desire for something new?
Well, part of it was I was presenting at a career conference where we were recruiting MBAs from the top schools in the U.S. And I presented the story on Ethicon Biosurgery and how we were growing at, over 5 years. It was 23% growth. We took that business to, 300 or 400 million in 5 years. And someone else who was a J&J alumnus said, Liam, you realize that if you want to have impact like that, the place to go is in startups. In fact, if you had built a company like that, you probably could have retired by now, which was exciting. But I think it's about the impact. And so the direct impact of being in a startup is what pulled me in. Certainly, if you do well, you're going to create great value for your investors, for your family, and elsewhere. But the impact is what's always been the driver behind my career.
Okay. So you stepped out of J&J. Where did you go next?
So then I was at Power Medical. That was the first computer-powered stapling company in the world. It was acquired by Medtronic. It was licensed by Intuitive. That was very exciting, where you are there guiding the way a surgeon uses a stapler. And as you know, powered stapling is now the standard in surgery. Medtronic has it, Ethicon has it, and of course, Intuitive has it as well. And so to be the first company that did computer-powered stapling, it was incredibly hard. You are pulled by the complexity of manufacturing for a stapler. Staplers are extremely difficult to make and to maintain the quality that needs to be there. They have to be almost perfect. So to do that from a startup is very different from, J&J, where you had incredible resources and great quality systems and things like that. So that was my first taste of it. I think the most powerful part was here I am working with the world leaders in bariatric and thoracic and colorectal surgery, and I'm influencing what they're doing and how they approach their procedure. That was extremely rewarding for, the kid that almost flunked out of organic chemistry.
Understood. And so you stayed on this startup journey. So it wasn't like you were step out and I want to be back in the comfort, if you will, of a big organization. So let's talk through some of those startup organizations and arrive at Qaelon too.
Yeah. So I've been in a number of different startups, always with technologies they have an idea, it's partially along in development. And my role has always been to be able to take the needs that surgeons can communicate and bring those to the engineer. And I'm the middle person that communicates those needs and then has to prioritize it. And so I always remember a nurse that I work with early on, and she said, Dr. So-and-so, this surgeon, always yelled at her. And she said, he always said, like, give me what I want, not what I ask for. And so one of the challenges of startups and new technologies is the entire market can tell you that they want this, but really it may not be what they really want. And so if you immerse yourself in the procedure, you can understand the way the surgeon is thinking, because they're going to ask for something, but what they really want is a solution that's farther down the road. And so when I think about my career, one of the things, and I had some incredible mentors very early on in my career, David Harris, who was my trainer back at Ethicon in Texas. This is too many years ago to even tell you what year that was, but David told me, you've got to be a procedural expert. And it's not just when your product is being used. And so the one piece of advice that I give to everyone that's in medtech is don't just go in for the part of the procedure and only pay attention when your product is being used. I would walk in the operating room. First thing I would do is go look at the patient's face as a reminder that says, this is why we're here. And I have a responsibility to you the same way a surgeon does. And I took that very, very seriously. So it starts with that. And then you're watching every step of the procedure. What is the setup? What happens when the patient comes in the room? How are they putting the trocars in? What other instruments? It's really easy to get distracted and drop into your phone and check your emails. But when you are there for the entire procedure, you can really understand things and learn things that I didn't know they were going to be valuable then, but things I learned 20 or 30 years ago, I'm still using now, because it wasn't just about the suture or the sealant or the stapler. It was about the entire procedure. And so that's kind of my baseline for how I started.
Okay. And so you're still in the operating room today as well? Yeah.
Yes.
So still being in the operating room, you do that still every time. You stay for the full procedure, make sure you don't get distracted, look at the patient beforehand.
It's a habit that differentiates you and your presence in the OR. There are lots of distractions. There's lots of noise. There's lots of data and different things happening. If you stay engaged, the surgeons will see that as well. And they'll know that, wait, Liam's not just here to sell his device. He's here to be part of the team and to learn. We're constantly learning. I'm not a surgeon. I have to learn. Healthcare is changing day by day. Robotics is changing surgery. Surgery is going to progress eventually to endoluminal surgery, which we're just getting started with. So you have to learn all of that and constantly integrate that information into your approach.
Understood. And with the naval officer background, has that shaped how you are today and how you are as a leader?
Yeah, everyone thinks that being a naval officer is about giving orders, and it couldn't be farther from the truth. So when you're a military leader, and I was on a ship for 3 years, the only thing that you can use to motivate your people, because you can't give them salary increases, you can't give them bonuses. That's very set in the way, promotions occur. What you can give them is respect. You can help them grow and develop, and you can give them time off. And so my focus from the start was, what can I learn from you? I still remember walking on the ship the first time. I'm scared out of my mind. And I'm an ensign, so I'm an O1 entry-level officer. And this young sailor comes up to me, and I found out later he was one of the troublemakers who had some discipline problems. He comes up to me, he's like, well, what are we supposed to do today, sir? And I think he was challenging me to figure out, does Liam think he has all the answers? And clearly, I did not have any of the answers at that point in time. And I looked at him and I said, what'd you do yesterday? Let's make sure we do it just a little bit better. That's all I had to offer in that moment was I'm setting the bar at a little bit of a higher level. And so then you're constantly learning, just like in healthcare. You have to learn the entire ship. if you're the watch officer under battle conditions, you have to know everything in the ship. You may not be an engineer, and I'm definitely not an engineer, but I had to understand the engineering systems. If we had a fire, if we had a flood, I had to learn all of those different things. And so that set the ground right away to be a different type of leader. And I think what I encouraged with development, we spent time, we allocated time for learning and training and development, which is critical in every profession. And it never stops. It never stops in the military. It never stops in healthcare. And so that was the grounding that I think I got. I think the other part is decision making. You have, when I was a watch officer, I had approximately 300 people's lives in my hands. You have to be ready to make decisions. Some of those decisions needs to be instantaneous, which is why the training is so important. And you hear that all the time now, with surgery, where with the changes in the way residents and fellows get trained, they have less experience when they finish their training than someone that worked 80 hours a week in training. And so I think that's a critical part of what I learned was you're under pressure, you've got to make decisions. And leadership in startups is about really good decision making. It's probably just as important what you say no to as what you say yes to, because your resource, your limited resource, is almost always people and time. So we're a small team. We have to choose the things that we do. What are the most important things to advance the procedure, to advance the impact that we can have in surgery?
Do you have any decision-making frameworks to help you make those decisions?
So in terms of decision-making frameworks, I think one of the things that is really important is the questions you ask. There's no way for you to fully understand and have 100% of the information before you have to make a decision. And so it starts with curiosity, the questions that you're asking your team, you're asking your market, you're asking yourself. Certainly there's some incredible, AI tools out there now to help guide you. But I think the questions you ask drive the outcome. And so if you're not curious and you think you have all of the experience, you're probably going to make the wrong decision. The world's changing too fast. Healthcare is changing. Reimbursement. All of these things are changing very fast. So I think it takes curiosity and asking the right questions. And then your job as a leader is to take all the information, all the perspectives, and try to figure out which person to listen to or which pathway to go down. And so I think the curiosity is really important. I also have seen with very subtle word changes where you can drive your team in the wrong place. So for example, you send an email that says, hey, we should really do this. Okay, well, as the leader of the company, my team assumes when I say we should do this, that's an assignment. And so what I've learned to do is look at those words in my emails just a little more openly. We should consider this, not we should do this or we need to do this, because my team is so dedicated and so passionate. They charge off and go after that before you even had a conversation about it. It also sets up a dynamic where they don't feel pushing back going, well, actually, Liam, we shouldn't do that because you've said that it's directive. You said we should do that. You need to do this. It's an assignment. So I think the second part is creating that opportunity in that environment where people can challenge your thinking. And I always think about the leadership model that guides me. And this may not translate to Europe, but certainly in the US it does. So what I call the Reagan model of leadership. And so regardless of your politics, Ronald Reagan was respected as one of the great leaders of the United States. What he said was, I never want to be the smartest person in the room. And when you look at the cabinet and leaders around them, and again, not the politics, set that aside for a second. When you look at the brilliance that was in his team, the only way he was going to make a bad decision was if he listened to the wrong person. That also meant all of these brilliant people were talking to each other. They were pushing boundaries with each other. They were challenging each other. And so the second part of my leadership matrix is allowing the people on my team to be able to speak and feel confident that they can dissent without negative energy. And that should be received by any leader when someone has the courage to say, you know what, Liam, I don't think you're going the right direction. That takes incredible courage to say that to a CEO or to your boss. The great leaders create an environment where people can do that without any heat. There's no retribution. There's no, I'm afraid to say that because then, oh my God, my bonus is coming up. No, it should be an environment where, and I thank people for that. Thank you for disagreeing. Thank you for the way you communicated that. And I think as a leader, the more you get in tune with what's the baseline of the people you work with, when they step out, especially above their comfort threshold to disagree or offer a different idea, the great leaders go, wow, there's a little bit of extra passion in that. I definitely should dig into that. If you just dismiss that, you create a culture where no one's going to bring ideas to you. That means that you have to get it right by yourself 100% of the time. That's not possible for any leader.
Completely. I'm thinking about a specific situation I've had this morning, which we can't dive into on a podcast, but thank you very much for sharing that. I'm sure that's super useful for a lot of people listening. So how did you even come across Qaelon in the first place? Where did you come across the business?
So actually, I've worked with Lee Swanstrom for many, many years on a number of different startup projects. Lee is one of the most innovative surgeons of this generation. He ran the Innovation Center at IHU Hospital in Strasbourg. Qaelon was the first spin out of that program of many. And Lee has many patents. He's got hundreds of papers and book chapters, one of the most respected voices in surgery today. And so Lee has brought me a couple of technologies over my career where he's wanted me to take the technology and take it out in the marketplace. For whatever reason, the timing wasn't right. And so finally we had this opportunity with Qaelon, and I had just, finished up with ConMed. I launched the RCO robotic solution. So I knew insufflation very well. Lee knows that my experience is somewhat rare as a commercial leader in that I have the OR experience, the surgery experience, as well as the GI experience. Usually you have one or the other. And so he came to me and said, Liam, I want you to look at this technology. I instantly recognized that leak detection is a big problem. Constant flow insufflation is an enabler of less invasive and less painful surgery. So I was excited about it from the start, and I saw just the opportunity to have huge impact. Not to mention that it's in the GI space, and as I've shared, the GI space is something I'm passionate about. And so when you take all that together, it was one of those, right place, right time. And certainly Lee has a very high bar for the people that he works with. And so, to be leading a company that he helped create is an incredible honor.
Awesome. So what did it look like on day one when you first joined the business?
They had done incredible preclinical work. The test was highly reliable. The number one challenge at that time was the test took too long. And so the way the test was working, it was 2 to 3 minutes to get results, which doesn't sound like a long time, but surgeons sometimes can be impatient. It's at the end of the procedure, they're ready to close. And so our first objective was, how do we make this faster? And so we were experimenting with the algorithms, with the test itself, and now it's down to 30 seconds. And often the first indication of a leak is in 10 to 15 seconds. So very, very rapid. Oh, and by the way, we haven't changed the workflow at all. It's the same workflow that surgeons have used for years. So that's what really got me excited to keep the journey going. Then, of course, it's a startup. So fundraising is probably the most important skill set early on. So you have the resources to do your development. And so, having experience with that in the past, what I didn't anticipate is how difficult the post-COVID tumultuous economy, capital markets have never been this strange and up and down. And then, throw in now, 3 wars around the world. Like there's all kinds of challenge on fundraising. And so it makes it even more competitive. And so we feel lucky that we've got a great leadership team. We've got a well-protected, patented system, and the financial community is recognizing that we've got something, that's going to have impact, which means it's worth investing in.
Sure. And it's not just the financial community either. You've just come back from Sages and done the Shark Tank. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So we won the Sages Shark Tank competition a few weeks ago. To me, that's probably one of our biggest achievements. It means that and let's talk about SAGES. So SAGES does this competition. It's a business competition where you are presenting not only the clinical impact in your technology, but also the business side to a number of very senior and experienced surgeons. So they've seen all kinds of technologies in their career, and they're looking for something that's going to make a big difference. And so this is a very competitive process. We were at the main SAGES meeting. So the SAGES meeting is a global meeting. It represents 7,000 laparoscopic, robotic, and endoluminal surgeons around the world. So for them to say, hey, this is the technology that we see the most promise in, was very, very rewarding and validating for what we're doing. And it was just amazing during the competition. I mean, we got grilled. We had some very hard questions, but that's the best part about the process is those are the same questions that CEOs of hospitals and chief of surgeries and chief of GI surgery are going to ask us. And so it makes you better, even though it was uncomfortable. It was hard, but we're grateful for that kind of interaction. And at the end of it to win it. So, we won a little bit of prize money, $30,000 in prize money. But I think what we really won was the validation and the exposure to the surgical community that we really want to serve and impact.
Sure. What were the tough questions?
So one of them was around clinical significance. And so we talked a little before about, okay, well, how do you know that you're going to detect something that we don't need to worry about? And so that was really uncomfortable to say, okay, well, first of all, there's not a data-driven answer to that today. There's lots of randomized controlled trials. There have been very few trials that have been done on the air bubble test because who's going to study something? Industry is not going to study something that isn't part of their system. And so I pushed back a little bit, and our founder, Aron Shlomovitz, also pushed back and said, this is part of what our system is going to learn and teach the surgical community is, so what is significant? And I think that's going to be a data-driven response that is really going to enhance the transparency around surgical leaks, around GI complications. And I will say that I think we have a slightly different or very different strategy about data than some other companies. It's my belief that if you are working in healthcare and working in medtech and your device creates data that can help the greater surgical community, I kind of feel like that's a duty to share that with the surgical community. Now, we can protect our algorithms. We can protect all the confidential information that enables our platform to compete and capture value. And at the same time, you can share the data that surgeons are begging for and want to be able to make better decisions. And so that is underlying in our data strategy. I think you can do both. You can serve the patient and the surgical community, and you can serve your investors by creating a technology that makes impact.
Okay. So to kind of bring the conversation around to a bit of a close, what are you most excited about for the future of Qaelon?
I think the thing that gets me the most excited is when I hear surgeon after surgeon say, Liam, it's inevitable that leak detection is going to get digitized, and you have the only technology to do that. And so to contribute in that way, the inevitability of digitizing leak detection, which is the core of our mission, and what that's going to mean to the patient, to surgeons, and to costs. I mean, there's so much that's changed, especially in the U.S. healthcare system around reimbursement, where the cost of leaks is getting shifted back on hospitals. There's Medicare payments if you have high quality risk measures like leaks. And then they've just announced in January of this year where CMS is capitating the payment to U.S. hospitals to a subset. So there's 750 hospitals in the U.S. that are now under a capitated system for GI surgery. That means that the reimbursement they receive covers all the complications through 30 days discharge. So before, you would just bill for those complications and keep going. And it was almost a profit center. Now it's being shifted back into the hospital. If the payment that's received for the procedure covers everything through 30 days discharge, that's when all the complications happen. That's when you have a high morbidity rate. You have the reoperation rate. you have a high permanent stoma rate. Those are the things that happen. So if you can stop those before the patient leaves the OR, you can absolutely impact not only the patient's life, the surgeon's life, but also the healthcare system and reduce costs.
Got you. And what would you like the world to remember about Qaelon moving forward?
I would like people to recognize and see how Qaelon digitized something that's visual, analog, not really in the digital surgery age. And if we do that, we can impact outcomes. And I think that's what every medtech leader, every medtech company wants to impact outcomes. And I think that would be the honor. That's me. That's as close as I can get to contributing as a medical professional without being a surgeon. And so I think that's what we're passionate about. You know, that's not only for my own family. I've seen the devastating impact of what leaks can do to a patient's life. And so to be able to help that is really exciting.
Awesome. So whereabouts does this fit into the robotic ecosystems?
So robotics is changing rapidly. You have a market leader who has executed flawlessly and changed surgery. And now you have 20, 30, 50 different robotic companies entering the market. And I believe competition is good for every market, especially in healthcare. There's not one way to do things. So when you look at the entrance to robotics, they have to find a way to overcome the lead that Intuitive has. They have thousands of robots out there. How do they differentiate themselves against Intuitive as a competitor? And that's where I think leak detection is one of those capabilities that differentiates any system. And so if you can use leak detection and constant flow insufflation to use that data to drive a different outcome, that means that you can compete more heavily with the robotic players that are already there. And if you listen to the podcast and the insight from, Steve Bell and Joe Mullings, they're always talking about how the hardware is not going to be the differentiator down the road. It's going to be the software. And so what capabilities can your robot do that someone else can't? And so that's where I think we have incredible value. Leak detection is something that's not present today. And so when you add that to any robotic system, you have a more competitive product because you can drive better outcomes with our leak detection and with our data. I think the other part is insufflation, where up until just a few years ago, insufflation was a commodity. Pulsed systems aren't the right approach for robotics. So with our constant flow insufflation, we can get those robots to perform at their peak. And so I think that's an enabling technology, plus the differentiation, that leak detection and the data that we bring, because robotic surgery is really about data. And the more data that you can add to that equation, you can change outcomes much more rapidly.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Liam.
Thank you. It was great to be here.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining me on the Crux of MedTech podcast. If you're not already doing so, please go ahead and subscribe on YouTube or follow the podcast on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is proudly brought to you by Crux. Crux is a medtech search firm which places pioneers in transformative roles to help us live longer, healthier lives. We do three things for companies. We help hire world-class executive talent. We help companies raise investment from Series A to Series C and execute upon M&A. And we also are building a community of medtech leaders to facilitate peer-to-peer learning and accelerate the companies to help them go faster. If you're interested in any of those three things, please reach out to me on LinkedIn or follow the link in the show notes to find out more. Thank you.